Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very pleased, very honored to bring the conversation I had with Joseph LeDoux. Joe is the Henry and Lucy Moses Professor of Science at NYU in the Center for Neuroscience. He's also the director of the Emotional Brain Institute at NYU. He's also professor of psychiatry and child and adolescent psychiatry at NYU Langone Medical School. He's well established in the field of neuroscience. Much of his work is focused on brain mechanisms of memory, emotion. He's also the author of a handful of books, such as The Integrated Mind with Michael Gazzaniga, The Emotional Brain, Synaptic Self, Anxious, The Deep History of Ourselves, and the most recent, The Four Realms of Existence, A New Theory of Being Human. That is the book we discuss in this conversation. We start by talking about his work with Gazzaniga on split brain patients. This is kind of what he was initially known for. LeDoux is obviously known for many things, such as his work on fear, but the split brain patients was kind of early goings in his career, and it's really, really nice to hear him talk about that, some of the kind of behind the scenes of how they organize this work. So that was very exhilarating to hear. He talks about the new book, The Four Realms of Existence, and what those four realms are. We talk about the idea of the self, personality and temperament, integrated information theory and panpsychism, the extended mind, habits and goal-directed behaviors. We talk about a little bit of the Cambrian explosion and consciousness. We talk about granular and sub-granular areas of the prefrontal cortex for consciousness. We spend a good amount of time on Tulving's 3 layers of consciousness. Cognition as a psychological concept. Fear. We talk about the higher order of consciousness and that whole system that he's kind of laid out in the book. Mentalese. The role of AI in consciousness. And many other topics. It was a real, again, honor and big treat for me to talk with Joe. As I say in the conversation, I've read his papers in grad school. I've looked at a lot of his research. I've read his books. He's absolutely tremendous for the field of neuroscience. Much of his work has been super influential. He's won obviously numerous awards, and it was really nice to see in this most recent book, The Four Realms of Existence, how he kind of puts all of his life's work together in a kind of cohesive system. Obviously, he was quite kind and generous in talking with me. He explains things extremely well, and it just makes for a great conversation. I probably could have just listened to him for another 2 hours. I just download all of his wisdom. It was such a blast. I really, really enjoyed it. Learned a lot, as always, and it was a real privilege and a big treat. As always, you can listen to this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. So get over there, subscribe, tell your friends. Feel free to contribute if you want, if you like what I'm doing here on the podcast. I'm also at YouTube as well for folks that like it there. And so it's much appreciated when people share the podcast and they tell their friends and they tell others. So big thanks to all the listeners out there for doing that. And now I bring you Joseph LeDoux. I'm here with Joseph LeDoux. Joe, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's a big honor.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, for sure. So you have done much work, and you have a new book out, which we're going to talk about. The book is called The Four Realms of Existence, A New Theory of Being Human. It's quite fabulous. Before we get into the book, why don't you tell listeners who you are professionally, academically, and what you're currently up to?
Sure. Well, my home is at New York University, where I'm a professor of neuroscience. I've been there since 1989, and I have been working on primarily how the brain detects and responds to danger for all those years, 34, 35 years, whatever it's been. Before that, though, I did my PhD studying split brain patients. And I think, if we have time, I'd like to maybe start with a little discussion of that because it's so fundamental to
Sure.
everything I've done since. So,
Hmm.
so split brain patients are people in whom the cerebral commissures, the connections between the two sides of the two hemispheres or two sides of the brain, have been sectioned in an effort to control intractable epilepsy. Um, it was a rare procedure done in the 1960s and 70s. It's done less so today. It was done because the medications that were used to treat epilepsy were not very effective in some patients. And so it was a kind of a last ditch, kind of a Hail Mary kind of hope that this would help the patients. And what it does is it prevents the seizures from spreading across the two hemispheres where they can build up some steam and have cause, more severe kinds of, episodes of the body. So, but psychologically, they're very interesting patients. And I just want to tell you about one experiment that Mike Gazzaniga, my mentor, and I did, because it became the fundamental theme of a lot of what I've been doing. We present, well, the classic situation in a split brain patient is you can talk to the left hemisphere because language is there, but the right hemisphere can only point and so forth. So it has no kind of verbal ability to share things with you. So it's a little clear, if there's anyone home in the right hemisphere, the way there is in the left hemisphere, you have a talking conscious person. But anyway, in this one experiment, we put two pictures on the screen. Now, everything on the left side of the screen, if you're staring at a dot on the screen, if you're the patient staring at a dot, everything to the left goes to your right hemisphere. Everything to the right goes to your left hemisphere. So we had, in one example, we showed on the left side a picture of a snow scene. The guy, it's a young boy, like 15 or so, lives in Vermont in the countryside. So we showed a picture of a snow scene on the left that goes to the right hemisphere, and a chicken claw on the right, which goes to the left hemisphere. So we said, and his hands point to the correct pictures. So the left hand readout of the right hemisphere is pointing to a shovel. The right hand, the readout of the left hemisphere, is pointing to a chicken. So we said, why did you do that? He said, well, I saw a chicken claw, so I pointed to the chicken, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed. Okay, so this is the left hemisphere talking. It made up a story, a narrative to make the outward behavior make sense. The left hemisphere didn't see the snow scene, but it knows that with a chicken, you have a lot of mess in the chicken shed. So the shovel would be used to clean out the chicken shed. So this was a fascinating kind of insight for us. We'd every night after these patients were all in New England, and we'd drive up there, and we had a little camper trailer that we turned into a test lab. And so at night we'd go to the bar at the local restaurant and just kind of discuss what it is we observed that day. And the conclusion we came up with over a couple of whiskeys was that this is something we do all the time. We behave, and then we tell a story to make it make sense. Because a lot of our behavior is controlled non-consciously by the brain. We just do things, right? Like I'm talking, I'm not planning it, and I'm just talking. And it's because I have a schema for a situation, like being in an interview. So my brain is in that sort of mental set. And so we're talking about my research, so I'm in that mental set. And so the information in memory that is relevant to all of that is kind of like elevated and waiting to be accessed. And that can be accessed by speaking or through behavior. And so the idea that we had was that, well, non-conscious systems in the brain might be the systems that would generate these kinds of behaviors, for example, emotional behaviors, that would and that we do all the time. But when we do this kind of thing and we see that we're behaving in a way that we didn't necessarily control, we being the conscious self, then it's a source of cognitive dissonance because we think we have free will, and if we're not controlling this behavior, we need to do something about it. So one of the things human consciousness does is makes up stories to make your life make sense. So from that, I turned to studies of rats because rat brains and human brains respond kind of similarly in challenging situations, like situations of danger. And I spent the next, probably 40-something years studying how the rat responds to threatening stimuli using Pavlovian, what's called fear conditioning, but I call threat conditioning, and learning a lot about the way that kind of learning takes place, what all the circuitry is, how information comes into the brain, gets to the part of the brain known as the amygdala. The amygdala controls the responses. One pathway to the amygdala comes directly from the auditory thalamus, if you're using a tone paired with a shock to elicit all this. Thalamus is a subcortical structure on the way to the auditory cortex or to the visual cortex. And so we discovered a kind of shortcut to the amygdala that could allow you to respond before you knew what you were responding to. And so whereas you could also get the information there through the auditory cortex, but it was going to be a little slower, but it would be more kind of elaborate in terms of its content. So the thalamo-amygdala pathway was a quick and dirty pathway. It could allow you to freeze before you step on a snake, for example. So it's a very adaptive kind of thing to have. But if you consciously then see that it's a stick rather than a snake, then you can walk on and just ignore it. So anyway, I spent all those years then studying how the brain detects and responds to danger, doing all that. But in the process, I would also write books. So my 1996 book, The Emotional Brain, was all about this Pavlovian conditioning stuff as a model, kind of an animal model of human emotions, especially fear, but not necessarily only. But then in the last chapter, it was called Once More with Feelings. And so I was also talking about how the human brain experiences fear and other emotions. I would, in all my books, I would say that we don't know what's going on in the brains of other animals, and we shouldn't over-attribute too much to them having fear just because they're freezing. Those are separate kinds of processes. I mean, that's an idea I had since graduate school, that the conscious experience of an emotion is separate from the behavioral responses that we produce in those dangerous situations. The conscious experience is, in fact, I think, one of those narrations. That's what consciousness is, a narration about who we are. And so in all of my books, whatever the book was about, there would be chapters about Pavlovian conditioning, but then at the end, I would put it together in terms of how consciousness works in the brain. So from there, we can, with that background, I think it'll maybe help some of the questions that come up.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's very, very helpful. I want to ask you about back to the split brain work that you did. Is there a sense with that we now understand that the entire brain is always working together in concert, and there's much to do, at least 20, 30 years ago, of, well, this part of the brain does this and this part of the brain does this, and we kind of isolated them. But how do we understand in split brain patients how the brain is still working in concert, even if they're not completely aware of how that's working?
Right. So in a split brain patient, right after surgery, you have something called the acute disconnection syndrome. That means that all of a sudden, the two halves of the brain have been split apart. So they're no longer in direct communication. A lot of their communication is externally, right? So the left hemisphere will see a behavior produced by the right hemisphere and then build it into the left hemisphere narrative about why it's doing that. And so you have this, the conflict between the two hemispheres is very dramatic at the beginning. There's stories about, the patient's in the bed and the nurse is walking by and the left hand goes out and tries to grab her in a kind of sexual way. The right hand is pulling the left hand back, or the left hand is pulling the patient's pants down, the right hand is pulling them back up. All kinds of conflict between the two sides. But slowly, over the weeks and months after the surgery, there comes to be a kind of resolution of conflict. It's as if the right hemisphere kind of gives up because it's no competition for this verbally robust, like socially engaged person on the other side. It just doesn't have those capacities. It still has some, visual spatial capacities that are not so well developed in the left hemisphere. And the other thing to note is in these patients, they all have epilepsy. And when you have epilepsy in the brain, for example, if there's epilepsy in the right hemisphere, things can reorganize so that there is some language in the right hemisphere in many people, and what's there, if there's epilepsy, it kind of reorganizes to maybe bring in a little more of what it could do, or might take away a little bit of what it could do. So anyway, the right hemisphere can develop capacity. So we had one patient in whom the right hemisphere developed the capacity to read. So that was a real breakthrough because we could ask it questions by flashing on the left side of the screen, "Who are you?" And the left hand from the right hemisphere would then pick out the letters Paul. His name was Paul. And we could ask it all kinds of questions like that. So when we asked the left hemisphere, what do you want to be, Paul, when you grow up? And the left hemisphere would tell us verbally that he wanted to be a draftsman, an architect. Whereas when we asked the right hemisphere this question, the left hand spelled out race car driver. So it's like we have, the left side and the right side both know who he is. They can both tell you he's Paul in one way or another. But they seem to have different kinds of goals in life. And that was kind of fascinating. So it was two different people in the same brain, but the right hemisphere is mute. It can't talk. And so in this particular case, there was clearly some kind of person over there. But in most of those patients that can't read out of their right hemisphere, you really don't know what's over there. So having language, we're not going to say that language makes you conscious, but it certainly contributes to conscious, and it certainly contributes to the ability to communicate what's on your mind.
I want to come back to maybe the examples from your work with split brain patients when we talk about the idea of the self. But before we get there, maybe I'll set up kind of a little bit of how you set up the kind of most recent book. Your previous book, Deep History of Ourselves. I'm forgetting the title here.
Yeah, the 4 billion year story
fantastic.
of how we got conscious brains.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book. One I highly recommend. And you say in the beginning that book was very much about how we evolved, right, as humans on the planet, and this book is about what it is to be a living human being. So less about the process of how we got here, but more of how we're kind of operating in the world. So what is it that we have this fascination of as we're living on the planet, of our mind, our psyche, and the body, and how all of these are important for our conscious being and how we're maneuvering in the world?
I mean, the only way I can explain that is in terms of the title of the book is The Four Realms of Existence. And so I'll talk about what the four realms are, because that kind of sets up what you're asking. Yep. So, it's not that there's no evolution in this book. There's a lot about evolution. So it starts with the biological realm. So every organism that has ever lived, anything that has lived is an organism. Anything alive is an organism. And every organism that has ever lived has lived as a biological organism. But some of those biological beings developed a nervous system. So life started about 3.7 billion years ago. and about, I would say, maybe 1 billion or close to 9 or 800 million years ago, the first nervous systems appeared, and those were in animals. So animals, and only animals, have nervous systems. No other kind of organism has a nervous system. So in addition to having a biological realm, we have a neurobiological realm. And there are three classes of multicellular organisms that we know of on Earth. One are animals, plants, of course, and fungi. So plants and fungi can move. Plants can send their roots looking for water. They can bend their branches and leaves towards light and so forth. But it's a very, very slow process. And for a message to go, from the deep roots of the plant into the highest levels of the trunk is a very slow process of moving molecules all the way through that plant. So it's not a very efficient thing. Plants are stationary for the most part. I mean, they can kind of bend and so forth, but they're kind of rooted, literally. Fungi are not stationary necessarily. Some of those, can have things that move around a bit. But animals are very mobile, and only animals. Any animal can respond in the flash to a stimulus. In a few milliseconds can move their apparatus around and move their location. So we are very mobile, very agile in nature. We can respond to stimuli around us, turn around when there's something dangerous and so forth. Now, that's not something that only animals can do, because as with many things in evolution, lower organisms, for example, bacteria can move around in their environment. Bacteria can detect danger. Bacteria can detect food and move towards it, move away from danger. So that's kind of interesting, but it's not something that, the three groups of multicellular organisms solve their problem of being on Earth in three different ways. Plants and fungi did it by being more or less slow in their responses, whereas animals did it by being very quick in their responses. Fungi are closer to animals than they are to plants because they digest food internally, whereas plants only digest, there's no internal. So it's odd that the plants and fungi are together in the grocery store at the same place. It's kind of just like a human thing. They have some physical appearances that look like, so just throw them there. I mean, you could put mushrooms with a steak. That would be okay, I guess, but it's not what we typically do in the store. So anyway, you have these three kinds of organisms. Only animals can have these rapid responses to stimuli. So the neurobiological realm opened up a whole new way of living on Earth. And it's been very useful to us because otherwise we'd never move. We'd never be able to manipulate things and put them together in novel ways and create science and art and culture and all of the things that ended up being done with nervous system. So that's the neurobiological realm. But some neurobiological creatures, well, let me just say the behaviors of the neurobiological realm are automatic behaviors like reflexes, habits, things that are just stimulus response connections that are kind of wired into or acquired by the nervous system, but require no kind of mental or cognitive control. So the next level is the cognitive level, where you have the ability to form mental representations of the world and use those internal representations to guide your behavior. So the difference between goal-directed behavior and habitual behavior is that habits are automatically stimulus response actions or responses that just automatically come out in the presence of the stimulus, whereas a behavior based on a mental representation is a kind of stored assembly of memory into a mental model that you use to guide your behavior in the moment. So the mental model is flexible because you can change your mind about what to do while navigating through the world, whereas the habit system is inflexible. You can only move on the basis of stimulus response. And then, so some biological organisms are neurobiological, some neurobiological are cognitive, and some cognitive ones are conscious. And I guess we can put off what consciousness is and all that till we get a little later in the discussion.
Yeah, it's a big topic. Yeah, so you've outlined the kind of the four realms of existence that you talk about in the book, and it's nice how you do it because you're kind of explaining, how there is a kind of interconnectedness there of sorts. So let me ask. I'll come back to this idea about that we started with this idea of the self. What is this? Lots of people talk about this, and lots of people have this ideas. There are some folks that will go full social constructionist and say, the self is just whatever environment or context you're in, and you can, be who you are. Other people will say there are these very rigidly defined aspects, and all over in between. For you, and you talk about some of the history in the book, with Descartes and Locke and William James about the self and how we build on the work. But how do you see and define the self, and why is that important to define? I guess another side note here is when you were talking about the work you've done with split brain patients, you could almost say that it almost feels like two different people in there, right? Two different selves in there.
Right.
I mean, it's not. There's one person, but how do we understand and define this idea of the self and why that's essential?
Yeah, so self and personality together are troubling concepts. Self in particular goes back millennia, and it's an ancient philosophical notion. And one of the problems I think we have in science is we sometimes take these ancient things too seriously, or take philosophical ideas too seriously. And then when we try to do science, we kind of force those things. It's like putting a square peg into a round hole in a way. We make it work because we believe that we have a self. And so we try to make it work scientifically. And there are all kinds of discussions about that. And, some philosophers say that, things like, there's no one has ever been or ever was a self, or the self is a very popular topic, but nobody agrees about what it is. And everything one says about self is controversial. So I decided in this book, what I wanted to do is to take the ideas of self and personality and ask, what are their features? Because the things that have been discovered in their name, I think, are important. But I think we get into trouble with the overarching concepts of self and personality. They imply too much. They imply that we have something inside of us that's making decisions for us and doing things. And so what I did was I said, let's see if we can have an entire comprehensive, I don't want to, my publisher called it a new theory of being human, but I think of it more as a framework than a theory. So my framework is that let's take all of that stuff about self and personality and repackage it into these four realms of existence. And I think it works well because you don't need self and personality to explain everything about a human being. They can all be explained in terms of these four realms, except one version of self, which you might guess what I'm going to say now, given what I said about the split brain thing. Self as a narrative is, I think, a legitimate notion. That's an idea that we talk about and tell about ourselves. So, when my last book, Deep History, I made a T-shirt that was available for purchase called No Self, No Fear. And so in this book, I have a T-shirt that is Yourself is a Story, not something that inside you that does anything. I just say yourself is a story on the T-shirt. So I think that this idea of a self that has has agency, that is doing things. Who is this self besides you? It's a redundant concept. You are yourself. There's nothing else besides you in there. So I don't think we need that idea, except as a narrative of the story we tell about ourselves.
Well, I fully agree with you. I think that the self is, the way I usually think of it is the self is a kind of a combination of all of our experiences that we're having, right? And that entire composite is what makes us who we are, right? So yeah, I
Right.
totally agree with the narrative,
And
I
that
think
changes from moment to
it's a
moment.
useful
Yeah,
fiction.
yeah.
Yes. But I guess that, what would you say? So in terms of like traits or personality or
Right.
temperament, these are different, but a lot of overlap there. What would you say, or is there enough things about every individual person that there are a few qualities that stay stable, right? That there are things about you that have been true your entire life, right? Whether you want
Right.
to map that onto temperament or personality, but there is something that is what makes you you, and there's no
Mhm.
other, Joe LeDoux, right, out there, and at least in this universe, maybe in the simulation or something. But there's only one of us, and there's enough of these traits that kind of stay constant through time. How do you understand that kind of stability notion?
Well, again, it's about, rather than talking about personality, let's say we take the features of personality, some of which are stable and some of which are not, and build them into. Personality is more like kind of automatic things: the way you walk, the way you talk, um, things you do, your preferences, and so forth. All of those are kind of low-level neurobiological realm facets of learning about who you are that you've acquired over the course of your life. So those are just built into the neurobiological realm. I think the difference between self and personality is more about behavior, and self is more about some kind of agent inside you in traditional views of it.
hmm hmm So when we talk about this like you-ness, right, the individuality of the self, what you're saying is that there are some things with, let's say, personality that are stable. Those are the things that are kind of the things that make you uniquely you, as opposed to the self, which is more of this narrative or useful fiction that we tell ourselves. But the
Right.
you-ness of you are some of those personality traits.
Yes, and they're built into the four realms.
hmm hmm
So you don't
So we're
need
going to see this in
another.
our.
Well, we don't need to name those things. We can name them as
Mm,
categories of what these realms are doing, like the way you walk, the way you talk, the things that the memories that the procedural memories that are unconscious and that stabilize how you perform habits and so forth. And those are all part of the
mm,
neurobiological realm. I'm not throwing them out. I'm just saying let's not call it personality.
mm.
It's just you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. So, in you hinted a little bit at the biological realm of things. One question I have, so you talk about again some of the history, and you had just mentioned some of the evolutionary concepts that are connected with biology and how that's important. You mentioned a lot of that in your previous book. One question I have is you mentioned it in the book, I think, in this one of the chapters on this section about. And there's been a little bit of some waves made online and in some of the journals about this idea of integrated information theory, and how this tells us about who we are, especially on the consciousness side. You don't have to wade in too deep into this. I know it's kind of a
Right.
thing, but
Yeah.
what are your thoughts about how we understand this idea of panpsychism, integration, information theory?
Well, okay. So, there's first of all, there's a difference between integrated information theory and research that's done in connection with that. So, there's a lot of research. Integrated information theory is about the integration of information at various levels of complexity um, that is supposedly underlying, consciousness and so forth, measured by something called phi or phi, that is problematic. Let's not go into the details, but let me just say that integrated information theory itself, the problem for me is that it extends beyond, well, the idea is that it extends into the entire universe, right? So it's not just about consciousness in people. It's not just about consciousness in animals. It's not just about consciousness in bacteria. It's about consciousness in rocks and iPhones, in the stars, and everything else. So that takes us out of the realm of certainly out of the realm of the neuroscience of consciousness, and into a kind of thing, kind of metaphysics called panpsychism, which is an ancient idea that is that consciousness or mind is everywhere in the universe. Now, you could maybe kind of get some kind of astrophysicist version of that, where there are lots of things in the universe and so forth. But the second problem is that the panpsychism quickly blends into pantheism, which is the idea that God is everywhere. So panpsychism opens the opportunity for a God in the universe to make it all the way back into our individual minds. Now, to me, this has nothing to do with science. If you want to be a theologian and use panpsychism as your explanation of how religious people have God in their minds, that's fine. I have no objection to anybody's views, but science has to be done scientifically, and this, to me, goes out of the realm of science. Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah, no, I firmly agree with you. It's interesting how some scientists are enticed, I guess, by the allure of it. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't study certain things. We should study all ideas, but it does start to feel very, kind of woo kind of science. And I don't know how I feel about that. So I agree with you.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, I just think it's a bridge too far with no data. I mean, that's the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess one thing here is I want to ask about is I know that Chalmers and I think it's Andy Clark years ago put out this paper, and there's a kind of whole industry now that's kind of pushed it maybe in certain directions that are strange, but there's this idea of the extended mind, right? Of like, it's not just brains and a skull, but that how do we look at the importance of embodiment or the role of the bodies has to play for the brain and the mind. What do you think about how this is important or not?
Yeah, so let's start with a simple example, which is muscle memory. Okay, everybody talks about muscle memory. A lot of people talk about muscle memory. That kind of implies that the memory is in the muscles, but that's not what is at play here. Muscle memory is in the brain. Memory is in the brain. I mean, you might have some adaptations in the muscle, but the ability to use your muscles is controlled by your brain. And so the muscle memory is not, it's function of memory. It's in the brain. And I think when we talk about, embodiment, it's kind of the same thing. Let's say mental or cognitive embodiment. It's not that cognition is in the body. It's that the body is in the brain. So cognition, the body is embrained rather than the brain embodied, in a sense, if that makes sense. So I think we have to, it's just kind of, it's putting things in the wrong place, I think. And again, with the biological, neurobiological, cognitive, and conscious realms, we can understand how that works, because you have the biological realm of the body, the lower body or the body in general, that is taking care of all the life-sustaining processes such as metabolism and homeostasis and so forth. Those things keep us alive. And without that, none of the other realms can exist. But when you have a neurobiological realm, the neurobiological realm also becomes part of the process of controlling the body in a more efficient way to keep the organism alive. But to do that, it has also inherited all of the biological realm properties of metabolism. Metabolism isn't in all the cells of the brain. So, the biological realm is giving its descendant, the neurobiological realm, some properties that allows it to work together. So it's like these are not little stacks of evolution that we build up that are stacked on top of each other in isolation. Each level, the biological realm, is entwined with the neurobiological realm, so that the things that you're doing with your nervous system are helping the body stay alive. That's why you have a nervous system, to help the body be more efficient. Now, the fact that we can do much more complicated things with it depends on taking those fundamental changes that allow the body and the nervous system to help keep the organism alive a little better. You then get more complicated things like mental representations and so forth, and consciousness, each of which interacts with the level below it. So the cognitive realm evolved out of the neurobiological realm. For example, we can talk, I think you mentioned you wanted to talk about habits versus goal-directed behaviors. So if we look at the habit system, let's just take the organisms known as vertebrates. So that would be fish, amphibians, and reptiles, animals and so forth, mammals. So reptiles, fish and reptiles are kind of primitive neurobiological realm organisms. They can, they have reflexes and they have habits, but there's very little evidence that they have internal representations in the sense of, cognition. I mean, it depends on how you define cognition, but the way I define it is in terms of using mental models and behavior. I think it's that mental models have been discovered very convincingly in non-mammalian vertebrates, except in birds. So birds and mammals are the two vertebrate groups that seem to have some kind of mental model capability. Birds can do all kinds of amazing things. And this is an example of parallel evolution, where these things were done independently. So birds and mammals didn't inherit internal representations in cognition from a common ancestor, because there are no common ancestors amongst reptiles that connect birds to the common ancestor of reptiles with mammals. Okay, so birds and mammals, why? Well, there's a very interesting theory, which is that the reason birds and mammals have this capacity is because, well, let me just state a fact first, that birds and mammals are the only two groups that are functionally warm-blooded. Bees and other insects and so forth can have some kind of temporary warm-bloodedness, but birds and mammals are 24/7 warm-blooded. Now, warm-blooded means that you have a lot of energy burning in your body, that's generating heat to keep you warm. And that capacity requires a lot of input. A lot of nutrients have to be consumed in order to keep that stove going. The whole metabolic capacity has to be fed to keep going. You need energy sources all the time. So to do that, you have to have, the environment changes constantly from season to season, sometimes from day to day, and so forth. So an animal that has to forage extensively to keep its body supplied with energy sources has to make good decisions, because if you simply habitually go back to where you got food yesterday, or let's say last week, as the climate changes from week to week or day to day, you have to judge, you have to make a decision. Do I need to go to this place today or that place? You might say, well, I know that there's some kind of fruit that is in a low terrain. Let's say some kind of vegetable coming out of the ground. But if there's been a flood, then that's not going to be a good source of food today because it's all going to be rotten. So you might have to go someplace else where you have fruits and nuts growing out of a tree rather than coming up out of the ground. And so without that ability to plan, you make a lot of mistakes, and then you don't have the food you need for the rest of the, however long you store it for. And birds and mammals can do that. They can make plans. They have the ability to have these internal representations. I mean, birds are not as quite as sophisticated as humans, but it's been said that if you do careful comparisons, they kind of give primates a good run, non-human primates a good run in terms of their capabilities. Not completely, but in certain areas. So it's a very fascinating idea.
Yeah, it's just the whole idea of corvids are primates with wings or whatever, right? That they're very very highly intelligent. So let me ask you. Obviously, in the previous book, you talk about the evolutionary story, especially if you were mentioning how important a nervous system is for many things, efficiency, and we see that. I want to ask this question. The Cambrian explosion was a huge bit in our evolutionary story of much diversification on the planet, especially after a mass extinction. And some have made the claim that consciousness, or at the very least, some of the progenitors or the early traces of consciousness, but consciousness started then. Like it started in that period. And they have all of these different theories about why consciousness starts kind of all the way back there in some animals. For you, when you think about, or what can we say accurately or confidently about, biological or neurobiological advancements from the Cambrian explosion, where do we see consciousness from how we define it or how we understand it kind of arising?
Okay. Well, my preference is not to do that. Let's start with behavior in the Cambrian and work our way up all the way, as far as you want to go. But let's say we want to, the fact that I focus on humans doesn't mean I think we're the end all and be all of life. It's not that. It's just that we care about humans because we're humans. So it's just me telling a story about what we care about. So if we take behavior all the way through from the Cambrian to present day humans, what we see is how habitual responses gave way or became the basis for goal-directed responses, and goal-directed responses became the basis for higher cognition, and higher cognition then became the basis of consciousness. So we can see a path from the Cambrian to us. Now, we can also then work back and say, well, which of those animals was conscious? And that's a hard question. How do you know? What I like to do is say, well, is there some principle that we can use to extrapolate backwards? And I have a principle that I think gives us a way to at least think about what consciousness might be like in other mammals. But I'm not willing to really go much further back because, we just don't know enough. It gets so complicated. So if we look at the human, let's say we understood much more about the human brain. And again, for the sake of argument, let's say that consciousness involves prefrontal cortex. Again, just for the sake of argument, because I kind of think that, but not everyone does. So if we just take it from the point of view of a kind of test case for discussing all this, what we can see is that there are some areas of the prefrontal cortex that are shared by all mammals. And these tend to be the medial, agranular, disgranular, subgranular, whatever you want to call them, areas of the prefrontal cortex. So these areas, if we knew more about what these areas do for consciousness in the human brain, we could extrapolate perhaps that all other mammals might have that kind of consciousness that depends on these medial prefrontal areas in humans. So it's like taking the function and the structure and using the structure to make a guess about what other animals, what other mammals might be capable of. So if we start with that point and then ask, well, what about other primates and the humans? Primates have cortex that other mammals don't have. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between these agranular and granular areas of cortex. So the agranular areas tend to be on the medial side, so areas like the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, insular cortex, although insular has a kind of granular area component to it. But these areas, like anterior cingulate, medial, ventromedial, and what's also called medial prefrontal. And it's confusing because you have ventromedial and then medial. But medial is also called prelimbic. But anyway, these medial areas with various names all lack a layer of cortex called granular cortex that is present in lateral prefrontal cortex in primates. So areas like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex that are very important in working memory in primates are lacking in these other mammals. So rats and other non-primate mammals have some kind of capacity to hold information in mind temporarily, but it's kind of puny compared to what primates can do. And it's believed to be related to this difference between granular and non-granular prefrontal cortex. So what does granular prefrontal cortex do for working memory? Well, it allows it to hold more information and to be more flexible than you can be with this prelimbic cortex that is kind of the working memory of non-primate mammals. So it's an important thing. And if we look at a lot of research on consciousness, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is often talked about as receiving sensory information from visual cortex and auditory cortex and integrating that information into a working memory representation where you can be confident of what you're seeing and you can have an experience of what it is that you're seeing. You can talk about it and so forth if you're a human, but not if you're a monkey, obviously. So humans and monkeys share that. But then there is another component of prefrontal cortex called the frontal pole, Broca's area, Brodmann's area, BA10, that has a component in the lateral prefrontal cortex that only exists in humans. So no other primate has that. So what might that be? Well, that might be where we have our self-reflective, self-aware kind of consciousness, as opposed to a more semantic kind of consciousness that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex would allow us. So what I'm talking about now are three kinds of consciousness that Endel Tulving, who I think is probably one of the greatest psychologists since William James, and he died recently. But Tulving had identified three kinds of consciousness. Autonoetic, which is this self-awareness, which he said is probably human unique. I mean, again, we never know, but it's hard to produce actual evidence for true self-awareness in other animals. The dot test and all that provide some, but it's not very convincing. So autonoetic consciousness, let's say it's in humans and perhaps some great apes or something like that. Noetic consciousness, being the more semantic, factual kind of awareness, would be in non-human primates. And anoetic consciousness, which is the complicated one, would be present in all mammals. So what Tulving did was base those three kinds of consciousness on three kinds of memory: episodic memory, for self-awareness, autonoetic consciousness, semantic conceptual memory for noetic consciousness, and procedural memory for anoetic consciousness. Okay, now, in my last book, I focused on the first two because I didn't know what the heck he meant by anoetic. It was just, to me, it was very confusing because anoetic consciousness is based on procedural memory. Procedural memory is supposed to be unconscious. So how can you have a kind of consciousness based on unconsciousness? And so I just didn't get it. But over the years, I'd had a long-standing kind of debate, conflict, so to speak, with Jaak Panksepp, a animal consciousness psychologist, neuroscientist, who he didn't like my perspective very much because he thought I was too cognitive, too behaviorist, and that I was not fair to other animals because I didn't allow them to have consciousness. And it's true, at some point, I was kind of denying animal consciousness because I just couldn't see. I had to focus on consciousness being completely cognitive, and by cognitive, I meant working memory and all that. I just couldn't see how you could have that given the kind of prefrontal cortex that other mammals have, which is nothing compared to what humans and other primates have. So at some point, though, Panksepp had also, with Marie van der Kerkhoff, had written about these Tulving's three kinds of levels. And when I read his Jaak and Marie's explanation of anoetic, I began to understand what it was. It's a kind of feeling of rightness, a kind of raw feel that you just have, that you don't have to acknowledge. You don't have to say, oh, I'm having it. It's just there. And you know it's there, but you don't have to attend to it. It's you don't have to talk about it, attend to it, or anything. You walk into your apartment or house, and you don't have to say, this is my house. Of course it's your house. So you're there. You feel comfortable. You feel right. But if you see books have been knocked off the shelf and the chairs are upside down, all of a sudden that feeling of rightness gives way to a feeling of wrongness. And you bumped yourself up into noetic consciousness, where you begin to cognitively conceptualize the situation. And all of a sudden you're in autonoetic consciousness, where you're afraid and annoyed and mad and all kinds of things are going on that involve yourself, your narrative self. So through Jaak and Marie's understanding of anoetic, I came to understand what Tulving was talking about. But I have a different perspective than what Panksepp and Jaak and Marie had, which is that for them, for example, the conscious experience of fear was a kind of anoetic awareness in other animals. Now, many of Panksepp's fans thought that he was talking about rats and other mammals have human kinds of fears and other kinds of emotions. But that's not what he was talking about. He said they're like nearly or almost unconscious. And so he's talking about this anoetic thing, which is on the fringe of consciousness. It's not explicitly conscious. It's just there at a low level. But for him, that all you needed for that was, for example, for fear, all you needed was the amygdala and periaqueductal gray and no cortex. But for me, you need, in addition to the amygdala and periaqueductal gray, for the experience, you need a kind of cortical cognitive re-representation, which I think rats can have some minimalist version of that through their prelimbic working memory cortex, but humans have and other primates have a much more elaborate version of all that. But only humans, perhaps, I mean, this is again a speculation, only humans probably have this autonoid consciousness where you're self-aware. So anyway, that's a kind of long answer to what you were posing.
No, it's very nice. I like the way you explain the granular and subgranular areas of the different parts of the brain. I remember reading that in the book and thinking like, okay, I would want this explained a little bit more. So you explained it very nicely. I also like how that you talked about the difference between Panksepp and Tulving as well. I did want to. I figured we could probably talk about it here. It's probably a good place to talk about it because you mention in the book, you talk about a lot of things in the cognitive realm, and you've been talking about some of them already.
Yep.
About the role of memory, attention, and different systems. But you said something in this part that was interesting. You said that you feel cognition is a psychological category that we've invented, right? And that's not saying that cognition obviously doesn't exist, but could you talk a little bit more about what you're saying there? And maybe you could use an example of other things that are happening in cognition, such as where does for humans, where do emotions fit in, right? Because many people will say that emotions have a cognitive element to them, or all these different things. So maybe talk about that bit of it.
Yeah. So I mean, cognition, emotion, all of our so-called faculty psychology terms are really inventions. I mean, if we, to me, for example, an emotion is simply a cognition on steroids, in a sense. It's like there's cognition. Let's take, let's see how to say this. Let's say that there's a general network of cognition involving prefrontal cortex and default mode network and all kinds of networks interacting with prefrontal cortex. But we're not going to localize consciousness in this scheme here. Let's just talk about it as networks of information processing that generate some kind of conscious experience. So if those networks, in my perspective, are used both for non-emotional and emotional cognition. So you can, if you are in an experiment where you your job is to say when you see a certain thing and to describe what it is you're seeing, there's no emotional component to that. It's just kind of a stimulus, semantic memory kind of thing. Now, so but if that stimulus that let's say you're not in a lab, but you're in life, so you see a bird in a tree walking through the woods. That's just a kind of, again, a semantic thing, or you might say it's emotional. It's kind of like beautiful or, something like that. But if you all of a sudden encounter a snake at your feet, that is a different kind of thing. But it's a more intense kind of situation where, in addition to letting you know what's there, you're also now experiencing, your heart is beating fast, your palms are beginning to sweat, you're nervous. All of that is adding to the mere cognitive stuff that you experience when you're looking at an apple or a bird or something like that. So it's the idea is that a conscious emotional experience is not that different from a conscious cognitive experience that has no emotion at all. The main difference is what working memory is working with. If it's only working with stimulus information and memory, you need memory to understand what it is you're looking at, to have the semantic knowledge. So, but if the only thing going on is that you are seeing something and has no impact at all, that's a very kind of minimalist kind of experience. But if there is something dangerous going on, then you have other systems that are going to be adding to it. So emotions are cognitions that have additional ingredients, so to speak. It's kind of like making a soup. If you put ingredients into the soup. You start with water and add onions and garlic, some other vegetables. It becomes, it's like a vegetable soup. But now you put chicken in, it becomes a chicken soup. If I'm from Louisiana, so if you put roux in and some sausage, it becomes a gumbo. Or if you're from the Far East, you might put some curry paste in, it becomes a curry soup. So none of these are soup ingredients, but they are ingredients that, when combined in a certain way, give the soup a certain flavor. I think Lisa Velman Barrett has talked about things like this as well. So the idea is that it's about what it is that you are achieving in a cognitive experience. Are you simply acknowledging something exists, or are you constructing something much more complicated? And emotions tend to be more complicated. Different emotions have different degrees of complication. But again, because they are, I think, in my opinion, both cognitive, then it means that emotion and cognition are not really different things. It's just kind of like one thing that is more complicated under certain circumstances.
Can we? So let's take the example of fear, right? I mean, obviously, you've worked on a lot with fear and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we see this as an emotion, but is it more of a threat response, or is it an emotion, or does it not really matter? Is it you're having a response to something?
Oh, it matters,
and you're having an experience of it.
Yeah. So,
what's the difference here?
So I spent most of my career working on the amygdala and its role in Pavlovian conditioning, which we used to call fear conditioning. But at some point, I had this epiphany, so to speak, where I stopped calling it fear conditioning and started calling it threat conditioning, because, I had always talked about emotions as separate from the behavioral and physiological responses. But, I thought of the amygdala as an unconscious emotion detector for a long time. And so I tried to use the implicit-explicit distinction that was popular in memory research to talk about emotions as well. But in the case of fear in the amygdala, it just didn't catch on the way it did in memory. And people would just talk about fear in the amygdala rather than implicit or unconscious fear in the amygdala. And I got to all that conscious, unconscious stuff about the amygdala through that low road that takes information directly from the thalamus to the amygdala and allows you to respond before it is, what it is you're responding to. So that had always been on my screen, but in an implicit, unconscious way rather than as an explicit, conscious way. So I talked about the prefrontal cortex as being explicit fear and the amygdala being implicit, but it just didn't catch on. Over the years, as I got more and more into the let me tell you how I got into the amygdala work in the first place.
Sure, yeah.
Or at least the way I did it. In 1985, I submitted a grant to the National Institute of Mental Health, called The Neural Circuits of Emotion. And I was doing Pavlovian conditioning in rats. And the review came back, and it was just like flat-out rejection. And the reason it was rejected was that neuroscientists don't study emotion. Right? It's not a proper topic for a neuroscientist. And I knew that, that there was a lot of, of course, behaviorism had pushed that whole idea. And a lot of neuroscientists at the time, and still today, are really behaviorists at heart. So the other complaint that the guy had, a guy or gal, I'm not sure which one it was that I was doing Pavlovian conditioning, but I didn't have a non-associative control group. So that's a control group. Let's say you give a tone and a shock. So the animal can then respond more strongly to the tone for two reasons. One, because it was sensitized by the shock, or if it had learned an association between the tone and shock. And that's what the non-associative control group allows you to pick apart. So I read the tea leaves, I knew the climate, and I said, okay, I will be a Pavlovian conditioning guy. And so I submitted the grant as the neural basis of Pavlovian conditioning, or emotional conditioning, I guess I called it, but it didn't go all the way in dropping that. And I got the grant. Not only did I get it, it was awarded as a merit award. So I got it for 10 years. And then I got a second American merit award on it for the 20-year stretch. All kind of masquerading. It's Halloween, so I was masquerading as a Pavlovian conditioning researcher. And then when I would write, review papers or books, I would bring in emotional consciousness. And that's where I was going this whole time. So, so I masqueraded in this way, and I would treat the amygdala. I tried to treat the amygdala as unconscious, but the field was not giving way. And so I said, well, okay, I think I have to do something because my name is associated with this whole amygdala fear center meme. Once something becomes a meme in culture, it's like the cat you can't put back in the bag. It's there. It's impossible to eradicate. And so what I did was I decided to write a paper that would sort of say, okay, we need a reboot in all this. So I wrote a paper called Rethinking the Emotional Brain, published it in Neuron in 2012. And in it, I said that, and if we're studying rat behavior, the only thing we're really studying is behavior, or that's what we're actually studying. We don't know what's on the rat's mind. I'm not going to deny that it has something, but what we are studying is the behavior of the animal in response to the tone. Now, if you use the word fear, that implies that the animal is experiencing fear. So behaviorists, many of my colleagues were behaviorists, viewed fear as an intervening variable, a kind of mediator between an aversive stimulus in the environment and a response. So it had no subjective meaning. Fear was not feeling, but all of the animal research being done was calling it fear. And if you look at, how do pharmaceutical companies develop drugs? Well, they put rats or mice through threatening situations. And if the rat freezes less or avoids less, then it must be an anti-fear or anti-anxiety drug. And therefore, when you give it to people, they should feel less fearful or anxious. But when you give it to people, they might be a little less avoidant, but they still felt fearful and anxious for the most case. So I said this, it's wrong. It's really wrong for us to keep calling rat behavior fear, developing medications on the basis of that, and disappointing people because the drugs aren't working. Now, if you told the patient instead that this is an anti-anxiety drug, this is a drug that will help you with your physical symptoms, your behavioral responses, and your physiological responses, your hyperarousal and your avoidance, then the drugs might have been viewed as more favorably rather than it's not working. It would be working if it's doing what it did in the rats, right? It was just the wrong kind of conception or the wrong kind of selling point. But the drug companies felt, I guess, that it was, they were going to sell more drugs to cure fear and anxiety than they were to make people less avoidant and less hyper-aroused. And there's been a whole problem in the pharmaceutical approach. The pharmaceutical approach arose as a way to kind of escape Freud, to make fear and anxiety and other kinds of mental problems less mental, to make them behavioral problems because of this conflation of the behavior with the mental state. And so the entire field of biological psychiatry was built on that principle, that you could use behavior as a measure of the fear, But my colleagues who studied rats and were behaviorists by nature and by training thought of fear again as this, not as a subjective experience. I mean, they said, well, yes, there's some subjective experience in people, but it's the least reliable way to measure fear. The best way to measure fear is by freezing behavior or avoidance. And that's the direction that the whole field has gone in, and why both cognitive therapy has moved in that direction, because insurance companies caught wind of the metrics being important. So if you can measure something and give it a number, then you can get a reimbursement for it. But if it's all, mental state, wishy-wishy stuff, then, nobody wants it. They weren't going to support that so much. So the whole mental part fell out of mental disorders. It all became kind of behavioral metrics. And the whole RDoC movement at the NIMH had, a whole list of metrics, including verbal report. But verbal report, again, was the least favored of any of those things for the people that cared about that stuff. So I think we've pushed the mental out of mental disorders. And, I talked a lot about this in my book, Anxious and in Deep History, and there's a bit of it in the Four Realms as well.
So for you, when we look at, in terms of conceptually, after all of these iterations, is it still appropriate to see fear as an emotion, or should we look at it as a kind of response that's happening in this behavioral context that you've been mentioning? Or is it just dependent on the circumstance?
I think that the cognitive, we have to give the patient their mental states, right? People go to therapists because they want to feel better in many cases, right? It's not just because they want to freeze less or avoid less and be less jittery. I mean, that's certainly important to deal with as well. But if you ignore the mental, the person is never going to feel better. And it's not going to come along for free by changing behavior or physiology. But, I do think that medications and CBT, exposure therapy and so forth, can change behavior and can change some physiology. And that's good. That's important. But I've proposed a kind of 3-step approach. First, tame the amygdala. This metaphorical, of course. Tame the behavioral and physiological responses. Second, tame the hippocampus. Tweak the memories a bit so that the patient is viewing themselves in a different way rather than, I'm an anxious person. No, you're a person that has some symptoms that make you respond that way. Then the patient might be ready for regular old talk therapy. Now, of course, every therapist does all 3 of those things, but I think you have to do them in a sequence to be most effective. And if you do that, you prepare the brain with the first 2 to then undergo talk therapy without the person freaking out because you've got a spider in the room and you're trying to do some spider exposure therapy and they don't want that. But if you do that, let's say you could do that unconsciously or through distraction, expose the patient to the spider without the patient really attending to it and focusing on it, then, I think maybe EMDR is a way that, you can have that kind of distraction to let the spider be there, but you're not focused on it. It's just there. But it's getting to the amygdala, because we know that you can present stimuli subliminally to the amygdala. And then the patient will respond behaviorally or physiologically. But if you ask the person, what did you see? They say, I didn't see anything. And do you feel anything? No, I don't feel anything. So there's no fear in the amygdala that is driving those responses. It's just a stimulus that's driving the amygdala. Fear is the cognitive interpretation of the situation you're in. There are 37 words in English for variants of fear or anxiety. And, it's not a thing. Fear is not a thing. It's a concept. It's a conceptual understanding of the environment. My fear is different from your fear because we've had different life experiences that brought us to that point. And I don't believe in basic emotions that are universal around the world. I think what's universal in the case of fear is danger. Every culture has danger. And so they have a word for danger. And that's how people experience that kind of danger, is through those words and their cultural understanding of what that word means. But just because we can translate the English word fear into all kinds of languages, it doesn't mean that all those people in all those different those different cultures have the same experience.
Couldn't you give a one way of understanding that could be, though, that let's take for example that yes, everybody is having the experience of the emotion of fear, for the sake of argument, in different places around the world, but that their expressions of those things based on their own personal experiences are different? Is it maybe just the expression of how it's coming out, of how they're showing that or responding to it, is the difference, not that there's not an idea of fear? How would you understand that?
Well, not all emotions have big, body responses. There's some that are, tamer. And so I don't think it's purely body responses. But, the way I would describe myself is that I'm a behaviorist when it comes to subcortical circuits that control behavioral and physiological responses. But I'm a cognitivist when it comes to the experience. So those are separate things in the brain, separate pathways. It's not like one thing. So recognizing that what the body is doing and what the mind is doing in a situation like that are separate but parallel things that happen because the same stimulus is activating the amygdala and allowing a prefrontal cortex interpretation of the situation. It seems like, they're coming from the same place, but it's simply a correlation rather than a causation. And every scientist is taught from the beginning to be careful of causation versus correlation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. So the last topic I want to address with you is, so we've talked about most of the realms, the biological, the neurological. We've been spending some time in the cognition, a little bit with emotions there. So I guess just to bring it home, is with the conscious realm, you talk about the multi-state, hierarchical, high-order theory of consciousness, and how much memory in the PFC are important there. Could you just talk about that a little bit more, and how this all kind of fits together with the autonoetic consciousness you were mentioning earlier?
Right. Okay. So I need to start with a distinction between what's called first-order theory and higher-order theory. First-order theory proposes that, for example, your conscious awareness of a visual stimulus is totally constructed by your visual cortex. That's all that's needed. Higher-order theory says, well, that's important, but it has to be cognitively re-represented, perhaps by prefrontal cortex, in order to be experienced as an apple or a dog or your wife or your home or whatever. So to me, one of the problems with the first order theory is that it means that, the visual cortex, the auditory cortex, motor cortex, the emotion areas of the brain, every kind of function in the brain has evolved its own ability to be conscious. That seems very cumbersome to me. I'm much more, I like the idea that there's some kind of something that we can do in a more general sense. Like if you take visual cortex information, you send it to prefrontal cortex, well, then you can be aware of that. But also, most experiences in life are not unimodal, but multimodal. So you have vision and sounds and all kinds of things going on in a situation. And so you need to integrate that somewhere, and the prefrontal cortex is an ideal place to do that because all those things converge. So in my multi-state higher order theory, the idea is that it's not just about sending visual information or auditory information to prefrontal cortex, but about a much richer set of connectivities. So, for example, a visual cortex state is meaningless unless it is paired with a memory state, a semantic memory state. So that you don't come into the world knowing what an apple is. You have to learn what an apple is as a semantic entity. And so by pairing the stimulus, by having the visual representation together with the semantic representation, and you can get that in visual cortex, visual and memory cortex are right next to each other, so you can hook that up pretty easily. But then to make that conscious, you need to have that more multimodal representation, sensory and memory. In other words, a perception. So a perception is a sensation plus memory, in my opinion. So that perception can then go to prefrontal cortex and be experienced in a more kind of complex, meaningful way. But all of those memory areas not only connect with the visual cortex and other sensory cortices, but also with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex as well, and also with an area called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which takes the kind of nascent creation of a schema, a memory schema by the hippocampus, and turns that into a more elaborate schema that can then be shared with the dorsolateral and other lateral prefrontal cortical areas. So that's like half of the multi-state hierarchical theory. The other thing, though, is that the dorsolateral prefrontal area also receives inputs from a bunch of other prefrontal areas. So all those other areas are getting all of these inputs as well. So there's a lot of information processing all over prefrontal cortex, coming from all the sensory stuff and memory stuff and putting it all together in the background. And all of that then is being synthesized in some kind of way. You've got like gates that allow information in to work in memory or not, but the context of the situation you're in, the schema that's being constructed in working memory, is allowing more and less information in, or sometimes being forced on it in a way. But what's going on is that it's not simply about getting a stimulus from the visual system to the prefrontal cortex. It's about nonstop, continuous, multiple streams of integration of information that is creating a mental model of the situation. That model, let's say if you're walking through an apple orchard, that model is of a day in the country and at an apple orchard. So you see a red apple on the tree, you recognize that. But if you see a yellow apple on the tree, you recognize that. And someone put a purple apple, model on the tree, you would stop for a second and think about it and say, oh, it's a model of an apple. It's not an apple, but you would recognize it as apple-like. All of that happens very fast because you're in that schematic situation where you have a template of what's going on. So the multi-state idea is that it has many kind of backdoors and a lot of duplication of processing that gives you a very rich mental model. Now, the mental model itself, in my model or framework, is not itself conscious, right? It's just a higher order representation of a lot of information. To be conscious of that, you have to re-represent it in some way. So this is a feature of what is called the higher order theory. David Rosenthal, a philosopher at Graduate Center in New York, is the kind of the godfather of all this. I don't think he's the inventor, but he's the current kind of leader of this. And he has this conception where a higher order state is not itself conscious. It can only be conscious if it's re-represented by another higher order state. Now, that for him, that leads to an infinite regress of higher order states. But in my framework, what I propose is that when you get to that second higher order state, that feeds back into the middle model and allows a loop to continue and to be constantly updated, so you can become, through that loop, conscious of what you were just conscious of, but in a more refined way. So the idea is that that the output of the middle model goes to a narrative stream, or goes to, let's just call it a stream. And the stream has three outputs. One is to overt behavior, like, goal-directed behavior. Another is to speech, and another is to the second middle model, the second higher order state. Now, but that's all non-conscious, pre-conscious. Now, why do I emphasize that? Well, I'm talking, I'm not planning any of it, right? It's just coming out. And that is the pre-conscious middle model that's doing all of that based on the schema of the situation I'm in. So I'm just talking, it's just coming out because I have all the information in that middle model, or accessible by the middle model, to allow me to talk in a fairly coherent, sometimes not so coherent way, but I get the information out. Now, once you get information into the second middle model that goes back to the first one to give you that loop, you also get three outputs of the second middle model, the conscious middle model. So the first middle model is non-conscious or pre-conscious. Second middle model is conscious. So the second middle model also can allow you to behave, to talk, but also to be conscious of what's going on. And so, in other words, maybe, I'm not going to be a big proponent of free will here, but I'm kind of a proponent of it. I believe that there's something to it. But even if there's not, if it's an illusion, it doesn't disrupt my model, because it just means that we think we're conscious. We are illusory aware that we're conscious, but we have the illusion that we're controlling our behavior. We're not illusory aware, conscious. We're aware of something, but our ability to control our behavior could be some kind of illusion. Now, I was at Yale giving a lecture and describing this very complicated thing, and I hope you and your listeners can work through all that. You might have to get the book to kind of see the diagrams to make it work. I'm sorry. I'm not being difficult on purpose. This graduate student at Yale wrote to me after I gave the talk, and she said, well, I have an idea of how you can tell. One of the things I said was that, part of the problem is that this makes consciousness research even more complicated than we thought it was, because you got these two ways of talking and acting, and you never know which one is in charge, right? And she said, well, I have an idea of how you could tell the difference in terms of speech, so that there are these, language models and so forth that can analyze, AI models that can analyze the content of play, text, people, like text analysis of a book or something someone has written, and break it down into different, areas of complexity. So what she said was, perhaps these AI kinds of things could separate the non-conscious middle model, which would be a little less coherent, a little less consistent within a paragraph, a little less all hanging together than the more coherent conscious middle model, where you're planning and talking in a particular way. So I thought that was a clever idea about her. Now, I didn't talk too much about exactly what the nature of that narrative that comes out of the first middle model is, but one way to think about it is what the philosopher Jerry Fodor had called a mentalese, or a language of thought. So the idea is this would be a generic language, a generic code in the brain that allows you to, or allows the mental model, the non-conscious mental model, to take in information from all sorts of different circuits, all kinds of different inputs, whether it be reward processing, homeostatic processing, value processing, memory, perception, anything in the brain that can get into the first mental model would, as a modality-specific kind of input, would then be converted into an amodal output that could be used in the three ways of acting and talking and experiencing and so forth. Otherwise, you could never, you couldn't take all those. You'd have to have some way to get the compressed, integrated thing in working memory out in an amodal way that all of them can use. Now, they're going to be different. So the way what you say and what you do and what you're experiencing are not always exactly the same, right? So there is some noise in the system added by the fact that you have three routes out of each mental model that allows some kind of output. But because each is a different neural pathway with brain areas and circuits and so forth, between the narrative and the output, the three will be somewhat different, but in general, fairly consistent.
Well, I will be very honest with you. I mean, that was absolutely exceptional the way you explained it. It is dense for sure, but it is really, really interesting. And one of the things I was thinking about as you were explaining that was, if consciousness is even half this complicated, it's almost impossible to maybe fully know it for humans. But one of the things that we continue to try and speculate on is, well, is consciousness something that is potential in the artificial intelligence that we build or are building or things like that? And you don't have to talk at length on this, but do you think those things are important to say, yes, we need consciousness for AI, or no, we don't, we just need highly intelligent machines? Or is it really important there, or where do you see the evolution of things going?
Yeah, at the end of the book, I do have a little short piece on that. And I think it came up earlier in the book as well. But the basic idea is that, I think human consciousness, in fact, everything about being a human is an end result in our case. Well, of any organism, it's an end result. But in our case, the case we care about in this discussion, is an end result of the 3.7 billion years of history, biological history, that we all have. Because each step along the way is some kind of, it's an accident that this thing and that thing were there at the moment that allowed a new thing to happen based on an old thing that was there. Almost all of evolution is taking the old and making it new. And I think without that particular kind of history, with all of the accidents and all of the happenstance that went through it, you could never completely duplicate it. I mean, even if you don't buy that, let me try another argument, which is that, a lot of the idea of AI is based on, that if you could model every neuron in the brain, and then you could have a perfect, artificial model of what everything the brain does. But that's such a superficial analysis. A neuron is like, there's a whole, gigantic amount of information and complexity and processes and molecules and things, metabolism and homeostasis, all that is happening in there and is within an environment of other neurons doing all that. I mean, you could connect the artificial neurons together, and you might be able to make, all of the chemical ingredients and put all of that in there if you, with enough time and computational power. But I really think that if you don't have that evolutionary history, it's not going to be the same thing. So I don't think conscious AI is in the works. I mean, we're afraid of AI, but I don't think the conscious AI is what we have to be afraid about. What we have to worry about is the mimicry of conscious AI. AI is a great mimic, but the emphasis on artificial consciousness, I think, is a leap from the idea that consciousness and intelligence are the same thing, and they're not. And that's the big problem with this whole, I think, enterprise. Sorry. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, the book is called The Four Realms of Existence, A New Theory of Being Human. It's absolutely brilliant. I greatly enjoyed it. I enjoy all of your work, all of your research that you've done. We didn't get to talk to many other things, but that's okay. It's an excuse just to have you back on again at some point. Is there any place that you would want to point people to specifically?
Well, I just think I think we've covered the topic itself. There are four realms. The realms are not independent. They're totally entwined, and they make us who we are. Everything about who and what a human is can be explained in those four realms.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Joe, this was absolutely so much fun. I feel so enriched with all of the wisdom I've downloaded from you for almost 2 hours. I'm so grateful. Really appreciate it. So big thanks.
Thank you.